The moon hung low in the sky, casting a sickly, pale light over the forsaken village of Dudleytown. The few remaining trees stood as silent sentinels, their gnarled branches like the twisted fingers of some unseen horror reaching toward the heavens. It had been nearly a century since anyone had set foot in this cursed place. Those who dared rarely returned, and if they did, they were never the same. A sleek, unmarked black SUV rumbled up the dirt road leading into the heart of the ghost town. Inside were 4 members of the Department of Paranormal Investigations, DPI, each one seasoned in the darkest recesses of the supernatural world. Leading the group was Agent Lucas Carter, a man with a granite jawline and eyes that had seen too much. To his right sat Dr. Maria Voss, a brilliant but aloof parapsychologist who had once been institutionalized for her radical theories. Behind them, tech genius Felix Reyes busied himself with a tangle of wires, while the stoic ex-Marine, Jax Cole, sat silently, a loaded rifle cradled in his lap. As the SUV came to a stop, the oppressive silence pressed down on them like a weight. Felix's gear buzzed and beeped, detecting electromagnetic anomalies, but there was something deeper, a hum that vibrated in the bones, a resonance that seemed to pull at the edges of reality itself. This place isn't just haunted, Maria whispered, her breath visible in the sudden drop in temperature. It's a wound in the fabric of the world. The team stepped out of the vehicle, their boots crunching on the brittle ground. The village was an eerie tableau, frozen in time. Buildings leaned at odd angles, doors swung on rusted hinges, and the air smelled of damp earth and decay. The wind whispered through the empty streets, carrying with it the faintest echoes of laughter, screams, and something else, a chant, barely audible, as if from a great distance. "Stay sharp," Lucas ordered, his voice a low growl. "We're not alone here." As they moved deeper into the village, their flashlights cut through the thick fog that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Shadows danced at the edge of their vision, and the very air seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Felix stopped suddenly, his eyes wide as he stared at the screen of his handheld device. "Guys, you need to see this. There's a massive energy spike up ahead in the church." The team exchanged glances. Nothing good ever came from old churches in haunted villages. But they were here for a reason. Slowly, they made their way to the dilapidated structure at the center of Dudleytown. The doors of the church were ajar, revealing only darkness within. The team hesitated, then stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of burnt wood and something metallic, like blood. The pews were overturned, and the altar had been smashed, but it was the figure at the center of the room that drew their attention. A man, or what was left of him, lay sprawled on the ground, his limbs twisted at impossible angles. His eyes were wide open, reflecting the moonlight that seeped through the shattered, stained glass, and his mouth was frozen in a silent scream. But the most disturbing thing was the symbol carved into his chest, a crude, jagged sigil that pulsed with a faint, sickly light. As they stood there, frozen in shock, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the church. The shadows seemed to ripple, coalescing into something large, predatory, and impossibly fast. Before any of them could react, the doors slammed shut with a deafening crash, plunging them into darkness. And then, the real nightmare began. The darkness in the church was not merely the absence of light. It was a tangible, suffocating presence. The air was thick, as though it had been replaced by something viscous, something alive. The team's flashlights flickered, the beams struggling to penetrate the inky blackness. "Felix, get those lights back on," Lucas barked, his voice tight with tension. Felix fumbled with his equipment, his hands trembling, but the darkness seemed to devour even the artificial light. Maria's eyes darted around the room, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She could feel it, the malevolent force that had been awakened. It was ancient, powerful, and filled with an insatiable hunger. A soft rustling filled the air, like dry leaves being blown by the wind, but there was no wind. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was a deafening roar that seemed to come from all directions at once. The shadows shifted, revealing glimpses of things that shouldn't exist, twisted faces with hollow eyes, skeletal hands reaching out, and something else, something that defied description. And then it hit them. A wave of raw, unfiltered terror crashed over the team, forcing them to their knees. It wasn't fear as they knew it. It was something primal, something that bypassed the mind and gripped the soul. Maria screamed, her voice high-pitched and filled with a horror she couldn't articulate. Jax gritted his teeth, trying to fight it, but even his military training was no match for the sheer, overwhelming dread. "Get out. We need to get out now," Lucas shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the cacophony of whispers that filled the air, each one promising death, pain, and madness. Felix's hands flew over his equipment, desperately trying to activate the emergency beacon, but the devices sparked and died in his grasp. "It's no use. The tech's dead. Something's jamming us." Lucas pulled Maria to her feet, his grip firm and steady despite the chaos around them. "Move. We can't stay here." But the doors wouldn't budge. No matter how hard Jax pushed, they remained sealed shut, as though held by an invisible force. The growling grew louder, and the shadows began to converge, forming a massive, hulking shape that loomed over them. In a moment of clarity, Maria remembered the symbol carved into the man's chest. It was a binding sigil, a seal meant to contain something that was now free. "We have to destroy the symbol," she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. "It's the source of this." With no other options, Jax pulled out his knife and ran towards the corpse. The growling intensified, and the shadow creature lunged at him. But before it could reach him, Jax slashed at the symbol, tearing through flesh and breaking the sigil. There was a blinding flash of light, and the creature let out a blood-curdling scream that shook the very foundations of the church. The darkness recoiled, and the doors flew open, revealing the pale moonlight once more. The team stumbled out of the church, gasping for air, their hearts pounding in their chests. But as they looked back, they saw the shadow creature still lingering, watching them with eyes that glowed like embers in the night. They had escaped for now, but the village had only begun to reveal its horrors. The team stood outside the church, the cold night air chilling the sweat on their skin. The oppressive darkness that had filled the building seemed to seep into the ground, turning the very earth beneath them into something foreign and hostile. The village, once eerily silent, was now alive with the sound of rustling leaves, snapping twigs, and the occasional distant howl that sent shivers down their spines. "We need to regroup," Lucas said, his voice hoarse from the recent ordeal. "We're dealing with something beyond our usual scope here." Maria nodded, still shaken. "The sigil we destroyed, it wasn't just a containment seal. It was a beacon, a calling card for whatever's lurking here. And we just unleashed it." Felix, pale and visibly shaken, was furiously typing into his tablet, trying to retrieve any information that could give them an edge. "I'm picking up electromagnetic anomalies everywhere. This place is a hotspot of supernatural activity, but there's something else, something that doesn't match any known pattern." Jax, ever the pragmatist, checked his gear. "We need to find out what the hell is going on before we end up like that poor bastard in the church." Lucas looked around, the shadows seeming to shift and crawl in the periphery of his vision. There's more to this village than meets the eye. If the church was just the beginning, what's the endgame? As they made their way down the crumbling main street, the fog thickened, wrapping around them like a shroud. The buildings appeared to lean closer, their broken windows like watching eyes. The village seemed to pulsate with a life of its own, an ancient malevolence that had been awakened and was now very much aware of their presence. They reached what looked like a town square, dominated by a large, decrepit fountain. The statue in the center, once of a proud and noble figure, was now eroded into something almost unrecognizable, a grotesque visage that seemed to mock them. Felix's device beeped, the screen flickering with distorted readings. There's something beneath us. Tunnels, maybe. Or something else. Lucas knelt by the fountain, inspecting the ground. Look for any hidden entrances. This village might have more secrets underground. As they searched, Maria noticed something strange, a faint light flickering from beneath the fountain. Over here, she called out. Jax and Lucas joined her, using their combined strength to push aside the heavy stone slab that covered the fountain's base. With a grating sound, the slab slid away, revealing a dark, narrow staircase descending into the earth. The stench of decay wafted up from the depths, and the temperature dropped further as if the air itself had died. Lucas clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. Stay close. We don't know what we're walking into. One by one, they descended into the blackness, the steps creaking beneath their weight. The walls were damp, covered in strange, pulsating moss that seemed almost alive. The further they went, the more the oppressive feeling grew, as though the earth was closing in around them. At the bottom of the staircase, they found themselves in a narrow tunnel, the walls lined with what appeared to be ancient, rotting wood. The air was thick with the scent of mold and something else, something metallic and bitter. Felix scanned the area, his device flashing erratically. We're definitely not alone down here. There's movement, lots of it. A low, guttural growl echoed through the tunnel, sending chills down their spines. Lucas raised his weapon, his finger hovering over the trigger. Keep your eyes open and your weapons ready. We're in the belly of the beast now. As they moved forward, the tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, the darkness around them growing thicker and more oppressive. The walls began to close in, and the sounds of skittering claws echoed from every direction. Shadows darted just out of sight, and the sense of being watched intensified. They reached a fork in the tunnel, each path leading into impenetrable darkness. Lucas hesitated, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. We split up. Jax, you take Felix and head left. Maria, you're with me. The teams nodded, the gravity of the situation sinking in. As they separated, the darkness swallowed them whole, leaving nothing but the faint echoes of their footsteps in the forgotten depths of Dudley Town. Lucas and Maria moved cautiously down their chosen path, the narrow tunnel closing in around them like a vice. The air was thick with the stench of rot and decay, and the only sound was the steady drip of water from the ceiling, echoing through the darkness. This place feels alive, Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. It's like the walls are breathing. Lucas nodded, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. Stay sharp. Whatever's down here, it doesn't want us to leave. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the earth. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the stone, and the floor was littered with bones, animal, human. It was impossible to tell. The oppressive feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step, and the faint sound of whispers filled the air, coming from all directions at once. Do you hear that? Maria asked, her voice trembling. Lucas nodded. Voices. But they're not human. They rounded a corner and came to a sudden stop. Ahead of them, the tunnel opened into a large chamber, the walls lined with flickering torches that cast eerie, dancing shadows. In the center of the room stood an altar, covered in blood and surrounded by rotting corpses. The stench was overwhelming, and Maria gagged, covering her mouth with her hand. What the hell is this? Lucas muttered, his eyes wide with horror. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows in the room seemed to come alive, writhing and twisting like serpents. Lucas raised his weapon, his finger on the trigger, but before he could fire, the shadows converged, forming a figure in the center of the room. The figure was tall and thin, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were black pits, and its mouth was filled with sharp, jagged teeth. It let out a low growl, the sound reverberating through the chamber, and took a step toward them. "Back up, slowly," Lucas whispered, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. Maria nodded, taking a step back, but the creature lunged forward with inhuman speed, its claws slashing through the air. Lucas fired his weapon, the gunshot echoing through the chamber, but the bullets passed through the creature as though it were made of smoke. "Run!" Lucas shouted, grabbing Maria's arm and pulling her back down the tunnel. They ran, the creature's growls echoing behind them, the shadows closing in around them. The tunnel twisted and turned, and Lucas could feel the creature getting closer, its breath hot on his neck. They burst into another chamber, this one even larger than the last. The walls were lined with more torches, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. In the center of the room stood a massive stone door, covered in intricate carvings and symbols. Lucas didn't hesitate. He grabbed the door's handle and pulled with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. Maria joined him, their combined strength finally forcing the door open with a loud, grating sound. They stumbled through the door, slamming it shut behind them just as the creature reached the chamber. The door held, and they could hear the creature's frustrated growls on the other side. They were safe, for now, but Lucas knew that this was only the beginning. The village of Dudleytown had many more secrets to reveal, and they were running out of time. Lucas and Maria stood in the cold, damp chamber, their breaths coming in short gasps. The stone door that had saved them from the creature was covered in ancient carvings, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering torchlight. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the silence was thick, pressing down on them like a weight. Maria moved closer to the carvings, her fingers tracing the patterns etched into the stone. These symbols, they're like nothing I've ever seen before. They're not just decorations, they're warnings. Lucas nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. This whole village is a warning, a trap for anyone who dares to uncover its secrets. We need to find a way out of here before that thing breaks through. But even as he spoke, the silence was shattered by the faint sound of whispers, echoing through the chamber like the voices of the damned. They were soft at first, almost indistinguishable from the rustle of the torches, but they grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Lucas," Maria's voice trembled as she backed away from the door. "I think they're coming from the walls." He turned to look at her, his eyes narrowing as the whispers became clearer, almost forming words. The walls around them seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the symbols glowing faintly, as if reacting to the presence of the living. "They're not just coming from the walls," Lucas whispered, dread settling in his stomach. "They are the walls." Before they could react, the stone around them began to ripple and shift, the carvings unraveling like threads being pulled from a tapestry. The walls melted away, revealing a vast, circular room beyond, its ceiling stretching impossibly high into darkness. In the center of the room stood a massive stone pillar, its surface covered in the same twisting symbols, glowing brighter with each passing moment. Atop the pillar, something moved, something that hadn't been there before. A figure slowly took shape, a grotesque form composed of shadow and stone, its eyes burning with an unnatural fire. It stared down at them, its mouth stretching into a cruel, twisted grin. "Welcome," the figure hissed, its voice a low, gravelly echo that reverberated through the chamber. You have come far, but your journey is far from over. Lucas raised his weapon, aiming at the creature, but the figure only laughed, a sound that sent chills down their spines. Do you really think your mortal weapons can harm me? It sneered. I am the guardian of this place, the keeper of its secrets. You have awakened something that should have remained buried. Maria took a step back, her heart pounding. What do you want from us? The figure's eyes flared with malevolent light. Your souls. The village hungers, and it will not be denied. Lucas fired his weapon, the bullets ripping through the figure's form, but they had no effect. The creature laughed again, its body dissolving into a swirling mass of shadows that began to descend from the pillar, enveloping the room in darkness. Run! Lucas shouted, grabbing Maria's hand and pulling her toward the far end of the chamber, where a narrow passageway seemed to offer an escape. But as they ran, the shadows followed, the whispers growing louder, more frenzied. The passageway twisted and turned, the walls closing in around them, as if the very earth was trying to swallow them whole. They could hear the creature's laughter echoing behind them, closer and closer, and the shadows seemed to reach out with clawed hands, grasping at their limbs, trying to pull them back. They burst into another chamber, this one smaller and more confined, the walls lined with ancient books and crumbling scrolls. The air was thick with dust, and the whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Lucas slammed the door behind them, bracing it with his body as he tried to catch his breath. We need to find a way out of here, he panted, his voice strained, before it catches up with us. Maria scanned the room, her eyes landing on a large, dusty tome sitting on a stone pedestal in the center of the room. The book was bound in black leather, its cover inscribed with the same glowing symbols that adorned the walls. This might be our only chance, she said, rushing to the book and flipping it open. The pages were filled with strange diagrams and incantations, but as she skimmed through them, she realized that they were not just spells. They were instructions. This book, it's a guide to the village's secrets, she whispered, her eyes wide with realization. If we can decipher it, we might be able to find a way to stop that thing. But as she spoke, the shadows began to seep under the door, creeping toward them like a living tide. Lucas could feel the cold touch of the darkness on his skin, and he knew that time was running out. Do it fast, he urged, his voice filled with urgency. We don't have long. Maria's fingers flew over the pages, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the ancient text. The symbols seemed to shift and change before her eyes, but she could feel the pieces falling into place, the knowledge buried within the pages coming to life. We need to reach the heart of the village, she said, her voice shaking with determination. There's a ritual, an ancient rite that can seal the evil here for good, but it's dangerous. If we fail, we won't fail, Lucas interrupted, his voice firm. We can't. With the shadows closing in around them, they had no choice but to trust in the ancient knowledge they had unearthed. The village of Dudley Town had many more secrets to reveal, and they were running out of time to uncover them all. Lucas and Maria plunged deeper into the heart of Dudley Town, their footsteps echoing off the narrow stone corridor. The air grew colder with every step, the temperature dropping to a bone-chilling degree. The walls, once solid stone, began to change, morphing into reflective surfaces that captured their every movement. Lucas, do you see this? Maria whispered, her voice trembling as she stared at the walls. Each reflection showed them moving forward, but the figures in the mirrors weren't exact replicas. They seemed distorted. Their faces stretched and twisted, grins growing impossibly wide, eyes hollow and filled with darkness. Lucas reached out, touching the cold surface of the nearest mirror. The glass rippled under his hand, as if it were a liquid membrane. He yanked his hand back, a shiver running down his spine. "This place is a nightmare," he muttered. "We need to keep moving. The heart of the village is close. I can feel it." They pressed on, the corridor narrowing further, forcing them to walk single file. The mirrors on either side closed in, now only inches away from their bodies. The reflections grew more grotesque with every step, the twisted doppelgangers mimicking their fear, their desperation. Maria couldn't shake the feeling that the reflections were more than just images. They were watching, waiting. Suddenly, a reflection of Lucas in one of the mirrors stopped. His mirrored self turned to face the real Lucas, a sinister smile spreading across its face. The mirrored Lucas raised his hand, pressing it against the glass, and the surface rippled again. "Lucas, stop!" Maria screamed as she saw the reflection begin to push through the glass. The distorted image of Lucas emerged from the mirror, its body shifting and cracking as it stepped onto the cold stone floor. It was an abomination. Half of its face was still a smooth reflection, the other half a twisted, fleshless visage. The real Lucas turned, eyes widening in horror as he saw his reflection made flesh. What the hell? The creature lunged at him with inhuman speed, its mouth opening impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Lucas barely had time to react, dodging the creature's attack as it slammed into the wall behind him. The impact cracked the stone, sending a spiderweb of fractures through the corridor. Maria grabbed a shard of broken mirror from the ground, her hands shaking as she thrust it at the creature. The glass pierced its reflective skin, and the creature let out a shriek that echoed through the corridor. The sound was deafening, and the mirror walls began to vibrate, the reflections within writhing in pain. Lucas scrambled to his feet, grabbing a piece of stone rubble and slamming it down on the creature's head. The blow shattered the reflective surface, and the creature crumbled to the ground, dissolving into a pool of liquid glass that seeped back into the mirror from which it came. Breathing heavily, Lucas helped Maria to her feet. "We have to move faster. Whatever this place is, it's alive, and it doesn't want us here." They continued down the corridor, but the mirrors weren't done with them yet. The reflections continued to shift, growing more violent and aggressive. Lucas and Maria fought off several more mirrored doppelgangers, their movements becoming more desperate as the corridor began to close in around them. The final stretch of the corridor was a tunnel of mirrors, the walls, floor, and ceiling all reflective, trapping them in a disorienting maze. Every direction they turned, they were confronted by endless versions of themselves, twisted and contorted, mocking their every move. "How do we get out of here?" Maria shouted, panic rising in her voice. Lucas stared at the endless reflections, his mind racing. Then he noticed something. One of the reflections, just barely visible in the farthest mirror, was different. The distorted version of himself was holding something, a key, glowing with a faint, eerie light. "It's there," Lucas pointed. "The key to getting out is with that reflection." But reaching it was easier said than done. The corridor was a labyrinth of shifting mirrors, and every step they took seemed to bring them farther away from their goal. The reflections grew more hostile, their eyes burning with malice as they tried to reach through the glass to pull Lucas and Maria into their twisted world. With no other choice, they ran toward the reflection with the key, dodging the grasping hands that reached out from the mirrors. The glass cut their skin, blood smearing the surfaces as they fought their way through. Finally, they reached the final mirror, and Lucas grabbed the key from his reflection's hand. The moment his fingers closed around the cold metal, the mirror shattered, the sound like 1,000 screams echoing through the chamber. The glass shards fell around them like rain, cutting deep into their flesh. The corridor disappeared, and they found themselves standing in front of a massive, ancient door, the keyhole glowing faintly. Without hesitation, Lucas jammed the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a swirling vortex of darkness beyond. "This is it," Maria whispered. "The heart of the village. One way or another, this ends here," Lucas replied, stepping through the door into the unknown. Lucas and Maria emerged from the swirling vortex into a vast, open space. The ground beneath their feet was cold and hard, made of ancient stone etched with the same symbols they had seen throughout Dudleytown. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and an oppressive darkness hung in the air, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Above them, the sky was black, devoid of stars or moonlight. The only source of illumination came from a massive, pulsating orb that hovered in the center of the chamber. It was a sickly green color, emitting an eerie glow that cast long, twisted shadows across the ground. "This is the heart of the village," Maria said, her voice barely a whisper. This is where it all began. As they moved closer to the orb, they could feel the malevolent energy radiating from it, a force so powerful it made their skin crawl. The ground around the orb was littered with bones, the remains of those who had come before them and failed to stop the evil that dwelled here. "We need to destroy it," Lucas said, his voice firm. "This is the source of the curse. If we can destroy it, we can break the cycle." But before they could act, the shadows around them began to move. From the darkness, figures emerged, twisted, grotesque forms that had once been human but were now something far worse. Their bodies were contorted, their faces stretched into expressions of eternal agony. They were the souls of those who had fallen victim to Dudleytown, forever trapped in its cursed heart. The creatures moved toward Lucas and Maria with unnatural speed, their clawed hands reaching out to tear them apart. Lucas raised his weapon, firing into the mass of shadows, but the bullets seemed to have little effect. The creatures kept coming, their eyes burning with a hunger that could never be satisfied. "We can't fight them all," Maria shouted, her voice trembling with fear. "We have to destroy the orb." Lucas nodded, his mind racing as he tried to come up with a plan. The orb was pulsing faster now, its light growing brighter with each passing second. It was as if it could sense their presence, and it was preparing to unleash its full power. "We need to get closer," Lucas yelled, grabbing Maria's hand and pulling her toward the orb. The creatures swarmed around them, clawing at their clothes, their skin, but they fought their way through, determined to reach their goal. As they neared the orb, Maria noticed something, a small, circular indentation at its base. "There," she shouted, pointing to the spot. "That's where the key goes." Without hesitation, Lucas pulled the key from his pocket and jammed it into the indentation. The moment the key made contact with the orb, a blinding light erupted from it, engulfing the entire chamber in a searing white glow. The creatures shrieked in pain, their forms dissolving into smoke as the light burned them away. The ground beneath them trembled, and cracks began to form, spreading outward from the orb like a spider's web. "Lucas, we need to get out of here," Maria screamed as the chamber started to collapse around them. But Lucas was focused on the orb, determined to see it destroyed. He twisted the key, and the orb shuddered violently, its light flickering as if it were about to explode. "Come on," Maria pulled at his arm, her voice desperate. "We have to go now." Finally, Lucas relented, turning away from the orb and running toward the exit with Maria. Behind them, the orb's light grew brighter and brighter until it reached a blinding crescendo. With a deafening roar, the orb exploded, sending shockwaves through the chamber. The force of the blast threw Lucas and Maria off their feet, sending them tumbling through the darkness. They hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of their lungs as they skidded to a stop. When the dust finally settled, they looked up to see that the orb was gone. The heart of Dudleytown had been destroyed, and with it, the curse that had plagued the village for centuries. But the victory came at a cost. The ground was crumbling beneath them, the chamber collapsing into a bottomless pit. They had only seconds to escape before they were swallowed by the darkness. "Lucas, we have to go," Maria shouted, scrambling to her feet and running toward the exit. Lucas followed her, his heart pounding as the ground beneath Lucas and Maria continued to tremble, cracks widening as the cursed heart of Dudley Town crumbled. The village, once seemingly dead, was now alive with chaotic energy. The air was thick with the scent of burning earth and the howls of creatures not quite human, their shrieks echoing through the desolate landscape. "Run!" Lucas shouted over the deafening noise, but his voice was swallowed by the cacophony around them. They sprinted through the crumbling ruins, dodging falling debris and the grasping hands of shadowy figures emerging from the earth like cursed spirits. Suddenly, a wall of flames erupted before them, blocking their path. Lucas skidded to a halt, nearly colliding with Maria. "We're trapped." "No," Maria said, her eyes darting around frantically. "There's always a way out. We just have to find it." The flames roared higher, casting a hellish glow over the landscape. The shadow figures circled them, their eyes glowing red with malice. Lucas could feel their hatred, their hunger. They wanted revenge for being trapped in this cursed place for so long. Maria reached into her bag, pulling out the small, handheld scanner they had been using throughout their investigation. The screen flickered with static, but she could just make out a signal, a faint blip coming from the opposite direction of the flames. "This way," she yelled, grabbing Lucas by the arm and pulling him toward a narrow, crumbling path that led deeper into the village. The ground shook violently as they ran, the earth splitting open behind them. But the signal grew stronger, guiding them toward a small, dilapidated church that stood at the edge of the village. Its once pristine white paint was now peeling, and the steeple had collapsed long ago, but it was the only structure still standing amidst the chaos. Inside, the church was eerily silent. The air was thick with dust, and the pews were rotting away. At the far end of the room, a single candle flickered on the altar, casting long shadows across the walls. "This place, it feels different," Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible, "like it's separate from the rest of the village." Maria nodded, her eyes fixed on the altar. "This is it, the center of the curse. If we destroy whatever's here, we can end this for good." They approached the altar cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. On the altar lay an old, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. Symbols, similar to those they had seen throughout the village, were etched into the cover. Lucas reached out, but before he could touch it, the shadows in the room began to move. The flickering candlelight stretched and twisted, forming a figure that stood between them and the book. The figure was tall and thin, its face obscured by a hood. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and when it spoke, its voice was a chilling whisper that sent shivers down their spines. "You cannot destroy what you do not understand," the figure said, its voice echoing off the walls. "The village is alive. It feeds on fear, on death, and it will never let you leave." Maria stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her heart. "We're not afraid of you." The figure laughed, a sound that was more like the scraping of metal against stone. "You will be." Without warning, the figure lunged at them, its shadowy form stretching across the room. Lucas grabbed the book from the altar and threw it to the ground. The pages flew open, and the symbols began to glow with a blinding light. "Now," Maria shouted, "destroy it." Lucas grabbed a nearby candlestick and brought it down on the book with all his might. The moment the candlestick made contact, the room was filled with a deafening roar. The light from the book exploded outward, consuming the figure in its brilliance. The ground beneath them gave way, and they fell into darkness. Lucas and Maria plummeted through the void, the light from the book growing fainter as they descended. The world around them was a blur of shadows and echoes, disorienting them as they fell deeper into the heart of the curse. But just when it seemed like they would be lost forever, the darkness began to lift. They landed hard on solid ground, gasping for breath as they struggled to orient themselves. They were no longer in Dudley Town. Instead, they found themselves in a vast underground cavern, the walls lined with glowing crystals that pulsed with an otherworldly energy. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, and the ground beneath their feet was covered in a thick layer of moss. Where are we?" Maria asked, her voice trembling. Lucas shook his head, still trying to catch his breath. "I don't know, but I think we're beneath the village. This must be where the curse originated." In the center of the cavern stood a massive stone obelisk, its surface covered in the same ancient symbols that had been in the book. The obelisk pulsed with a dark energy, and Lucas could feel its power resonating through the ground. "This is it," Lucas said, his voice filled with determination. "This is the source. If we destroy it, we can end the curse for good." But as they approached the obelisk, the shadows around them began to move again. The creatures that had pursued them in Dudley Town now emerged from the darkness, their forms twisted and grotesque. Maria grabbed Lucas's arm, her voice filled with fear. "We don't have time for this. We need to destroy it now." Lucas nodded, grabbing a large rock from the ground and hurling it at the obelisk. The rock shattered on impact, but the obelisk remained intact, its energy growing stronger. "Lucas, look out!" Maria screamed as one of the creatures lunged at him, its claws outstretched. Lucas barely had time to react, dodging the creature's attack and stumbling backward. The creature's claws raked across his arm, leaving deep gashes that bled profusely. But instead of pain, Lucas felt a surge of anger. The curse had taken everything from them, and he wasn't going to let it win. He grabbed another rock and hurled it at the obelisk with all his strength. This time, the rock struck the obelisk with a resounding crack, and the symbols began to glow brighter. Maria joined him, throwing rocks at the obelisk as the creatures closed in around them. The ground shook with each impact, and the air was filled with the sound of cracking stone. Finally, with one last, desperate throw, Lucas struck the obelisk with enough force to shatter it. The obelisk exploded in a burst of light, and the creatures let out a final, agonized scream before dissolving into the darkness. The cavern began to collapse around them, the walls crumbling as the energy that had sustained the curse was released. "Run!" Lucas shouted, grabbing Maria's hand and pulling her toward the exit. They sprinted through the collapsing cavern, dodging falling debris and the remnants of the curse that still clung to the walls. Finally, they burst out of the cavern and into the daylight. The village of Dudley Town lay in ruins behind them, the curse finally broken. Lucas and Maria collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath as they watched the last remnants of the cursed village crumble into dust. "It's over," Maria said, her voice filled with relief. Lucas nodded, his heart still racing. "Yeah, it's over." But as they sat there, catching their breath, they couldn't help but wonder, had they truly escaped the curse? Or had they merely unleashed something far worse? The village of Dudley Town may have been destroyed, but the darkness that had plagued it for centuries was not so easily defeated. And as they left the ruins behind, they knew one thing for certain: the curse of Dudley Town would never be truly gone. It would live on, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to stumble into its grasp.